Welcome to today's episode, where we delve into the profound contributions of Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak in post-colonial studies. Dr. Rathod, what makes Spivak's work stand out in this field?
Spivak's work is pivotal due to her nuanced critique of Western intellectuals who claim to represent marginalized groups, particularly in her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? She highlights how these groups often can't speak in hegemonic discourses.
That's fascinating. Could you provide an example of how she illustrates this silencing in practice?
Certainly, in her analysis of sati, Spivak demonstrates how both colonial and patriarchal narratives silenced Indian women, reducing them to mere objects of debate. This reflects a broader issue of representation in post-colonial contexts.
Critics might argue that this focus on representation overlooks material conditions. How does Spivak address such criticisms?
Spivak acknowledges these critiques, emphasizing the need for a critical vocabulary that represents the complexities of post-colonial societies without erasing specificities. Her work urges scholars to remain reflexive about their positionality.
Moving on to Spivak's use of deconstruction in post-colonial theory, can you explain how she integrates Derrida's ideas into her critique of imperialism?
Spivak employs deconstruction to reveal how imperialist ideologies are embedded in Western philosophy. Her book, A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason, interrogates canonical thinkers like Kant and Hegel, exposing their contributions to colonialist thought.
But isn't there a risk that relying on Western theories could reinforce the intellectual colonialism she critiques?
Indeed, some scholars argue that her reliance on Western theory might perpetuate the very structures she critiques. However, Spivak uses these theories as tools to subvert and rethink colonial legacies rather than uphold them.
How does this approach inform contemporary post-colonial studies?
Her method inspires scholars to engage critically with dominant discourses, blending deconstruction, feminism, and Marxism to challenge and redefine post-colonial frameworks.
Let's explore Spivak's relationship with subaltern studies. How does she engage with this scholarly group?
While Spivak appreciates their focus on marginalized groups, she critiques their portrayal of subalterns as autonomous political agents, arguing it oversimplifies complex social realities by ignoring intersections of gender and culture.
Could you give an anecdotal example of how this complexity is often overlooked?
Certainly, consider the portrayal of peasant revolts as purely class struggles. Spivak argues that such narratives neglect the gendered and cultural dimensions which are crucial for a comprehensive understanding.
Some may contend that her critique weakens subaltern agency. How does she respond to such claims?
Spivak emphasizes the importance of not romanticizing subalterns as pure voices of resistance. She urges for a nuanced approach that acknowledges the structural conditions that often silence these groups.
Finally, let's discuss Spivak's integration of feminism into post-colonial studies. How does she connect these two critical frameworks?
Spivak highlights the intersection of women's oppression with colonialism, critiquing Western feminism for sometimes marginalizing women from the global South. She calls for a framework that addresses multiple dimensions of oppression.
Can you provide a real-world application of this integrated approach?
Certainly, in global development policies, Spivak's insights encourage us to consider how initiatives targeting women's empowerment might inadvertently replicate imperialist structures if not critically examined.
Looking forward, how might Spivak's feminist post-colonial critique evolve?
Spivak's work continues to inspire scholars to adopt a self-reflexive approach, ensuring that feminist and post-colonial discourses remain dynamic and responsive to changing global contexts.
Dr. Rathod, Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak's concept of subalternity is central to post-colonial discourse. Could you explain its significance in understanding marginalized voices?
Certainly, Spivak defines the subaltern as those marginalized beyond the reach of hegemonic power, not just materially but epistemically. For example, indigenous voices were often erased by colonial narratives, a form of epistemic violence Spivak highlights.
A powerful notion indeed. But some argue that these frameworks risk romanticizing subaltern groups. How does Spivak address this concern?
That's a valid critique. Spivak cautions against idealizing subalterns. She emphasizes recognizing internal diversities within these groups rather than viewing them as a monolith, which she argues can perpetuate existing power dynamics.
A crucial point for contemporary discourse. Looking ahead, how can we ensure that subaltern voices are genuinely heard, not just represented?
Forward-looking efforts should focus on creating spaces where subaltern groups can engage on their own terms. This involves dismantling existing epistemic hierarchies and promoting diverse knowledge frameworks.
Dr. Rathod, Spivak's concept of epistemic violence is pivotal. How does it manifest in literature and discourse?
Epistemic violence occurs when dominant narratives such as colonial or patriarchal stories erase or distort subaltern perspectives. The colonial portrayal of Sati, for instance, served to justify colonial rule while silencing the women's own voices.
But isn't there a danger in merely flipping the narrative, potentially creating reverse epistemic violence?
Indeed, replacing one dominant narrative with another isn't the solution. Spivak calls for a nuanced approach where the complexity of subaltern experiences is acknowledged, avoiding simplistic reversals of power.
Given these challenges, how can scholars contribute positively without perpetuating epistemic violence?
Scholars should engage in self-reflexivity, critically examining their biases and power dynamics in representation. This prevents the co-option of subaltern narratives and promotes ethical scholarship.
The phrase, "the subaltern cannot speak," is often quoted. Dr. Rathod, what does Spivak mean by this, and why is it controversial?
Spivak argues that subaltern voices are often mediated through hegemonic lenses, distorting their authenticity. The controversy lies in the implication that subalterns lack agency, which some interpret as disempowering.
Is there a counterargument that subalterns do have ways of making themselves heard?
Certainly, while hegemonic structures pose barriers, subalterns often find innovative ways to assert their agency, such as through grassroots movements or alternative media, challenging the idea that they are entirely voiceless.
Given these dynamics, how can future discourse evolve to better accommodate subaltern perspectives?
Future discourse should strive for inclusivity by actively incorporating subaltern narratives in decision-making processes, ensuring they are not merely passive subjects but active participants in the dialogue.
Dr. Rathod, Spivak emphasizes ethical responsibility in engaging with subaltern voices. What does this entail for academics and activists?
It involves recognizing the limits of one's own perspective and avoiding the appropriation of subaltern narratives. Instead of speaking for them, creating platforms for subalterns to articulate their concerns is crucial.
Some might argue that this approach risks inaction. How would Spivak respond to such a critique?
Spivak would likely argue that ethical representation requires patience and humility. The goal isn't to act hastily but to foster genuine empowerment by supporting subaltern-led initiatives. They underscore the importance of intersectionality and equity. By prioritizing diverse voices and addressing systemic inequalities, global justice movements can become more inclusive and effective.